Hello, everybody. Welcome to our bi-monthly Bridge Culture Club. Today we are discussing Enough to Lose, and today's event is hosted by Bridge Michigan. Um, I'm Jackie Garrett. I work here on staff at Bridge Michigan. My colleague Emma is helping out today as well. Thank you all for joining us today. In case you aren't that familiar with us, Bridge MI is Michigan's nonprofit, nonpartisan news source covering issues that matter to you and your community. You can subscribe for free at www.bridgemi.com. Also, for those of you who are current Bridge Club members, which includes anyone who has donated to Bridge over the past year, you get a number of benefits, including access to a free electronic copy of each Bridge Culture Club selection. You can become a member today by visiting the link that we will drop into the chat in just a moment. Today, we are so lucky to be joined by RS Deeren. I'll give a full introduction of him momentarily, but we are incredibly honored that he was willing to join us for a discussion of his book. The schedule for today's discussion is this. I'll be introducing RS Deeren. He will honor us with a reading from his collection, and then after that, I will lead a discussion with RS about the book for about 40 minutes. If you have any questions for the author, we would love to address those closer to the back half of our event today. So please type your questions into the chat at any time, and we'll be sure to collect those. And we will conclude by 1:30 p.m. We will be recording this discussion and posting the recording on Bridge's website, again, www.bridgemi.com. So keep an eye out for that. And now I'd like to introduce RS Deeren. RS Deeren is the author of Enough to Lose. He received his MFA from Columbia College, Chicago, and PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. He was the 2016 Union League Club of Chicago Libraries Writer in Residence and a 2015 Luminart Cultural Foundation Creative Writing Fellow. The title story to Enough to Lose has been anthologized in Tales of Two Americas, edited by John Freeman. His fiction, nonfiction, and poetry appears in the Great Lakes Review, Joyland, Midwestern Gothic, and elsewhere. He is from rural Michigan, where he worked as a line cook, a substitute teacher, a landscaper, a banker, and a lumberjack. He's a man of many lives, as you can see. Currently, he is an assistant professor of creative writing at Austin Peay State University in Clarksville, Tennessee. Before we begin today's discussion, RS is going to start us off by reading a passage from Enough to Lose. So I will hand this over to you, RS.
Thanks everybody. Thanks Jackie so much, and thanks to Bridge Michigan and the Culture Club for hosting me. It was such an honor, and as I was saying before we started the event, it's just really nice not being in Michigan anymore. It's been a little over a decade since I lived in the state. It's really nice to have home reach out, so it makes me feel like I'm still at home. So I'm just going to read a little bit from a middle story in Enough to Lose. I'm going to read from the story Getting Out. It's one of the earlier pieces that I read, that I wrote, and it takes place. I'll read right from the beginning of the story. It just takes place. All these stories are connected. So this one in time is a few years after the 2008 recession and housing crisis. And I'll only read a couple pages. Getting Out. Stacy was my PO this time around. She had a small office in a county annex building on Saginaw's east side. Unlike my last PO, Stacy was newer to the job, which was great for guys like me. It meant that she still believed in the work and hadn't been ground down by, well, by guys like me. Stacy, in so many words, gave a shit, and that was a good place to start. She even ended every check-in by telling me, "Stay successful." And I had been out for only 4 months then, but was starting to get a feel for how my life was going to play out for the next 32. Keep working, keep sober, keep my head down. I walked into this last meeting though, and Stacy didn't have that "stay successful" vibe. She was nose deep in my file. "Morning," I said. "That coffee sure smells good." She motioned for me to sit down. "Have a seat, Calvin," she said. She didn't look up. You still working at Kroger? Stocking shelves 3 nights a week, I said, going on 3 months. Most of my coworkers were high school kids and were good for ditching shifts. I was able to pick up 3 mornings and filled the week working doubles. A landscape crew was unloading one of those zero-turn mowers outside of Stacy's window. Used to be that the state or the county had inmates do it cheap. I'd done it myself and tried to get on with a new operation out in Caro the first time I was out. That was in the middle of the recession, and there were too many folks looking for work who didn't have criminal backgrounds. I didn't stand a chance. Of course, all my file said was that I was unemployed at the time of my most recent arrest, and now I was barely employed. But still no apartment of your own? Stacy added. She must have really found my file interesting because she hadn't once looked up at me, just kept turning reports over. What's with the rapid fire questions? I asked. Calvin, we're together for 3 years, she said. In a perfect world, you find a permanent place to live and a job that can pay for it. Then you keep that job for the duration of your parole. But in the real world, you might get fired in, say, a year. You can't pay rent and you have to move. When that happens, I can help, but only if you have a track record of checking off all these little boxes in your file as early as possible. You don't have enough credit. 3 nights a week on minimum wage doesn't leave me much, I said. I had couch surfed for the first month I was out, and now I was trying to make it work at a weekly motel off of Michigan Highway 13. Every time I filled out an apartment application, I stopped when it asked, "Have you ever been convicted of a felony?" How was I supposed to make anything more of what I had? The state gave me what they legally determined was enough freedom, but it wasn't enough to grow any kind of new life. It's hard finding more work when bosses ask if I got a car, I added. You don't have a car? Stacy paged through my file and jotted down a note. Well, not exactly, I said. My ex-wife has it. It wouldn't matter much if I had it. I'm not allowed to drive it. One of the landscapers, in a bright green shirt and face mask, glided past the window with a weed whacker. That's not true, Stacy said. She flipped all the way back to the beginning of my file, back when I was just baby convict Cal. You lost your license your first arrest because you refused a BAC test, then didn't show up for your hearing. She flipped back to the current paper version of me. You've set up a repayment schedule with Saginaw County. Go to the Secretary of State's office and get a probationary license. You can drive if it's for work, if it's for parole obligations, or for emergencies. And I mean that, Calvin. If you're caught driving for anything else with your record, the state of Michigan will send you right back in. But I still got to get my car from my ex-wife, I said. That's between you and her, Stacy said. She closed my file, and that was that. And I'll end right there. Thanks.
Thank, thank you so much for sharing a portion of that story with us and doing a reading. Um, So before I begin, asking you questions a little bit more about this collection, I think, myself and our listeners are really interested in learning more about you and your connection to the thumb. So I guess I'll start with asking you, how has your own relationship with Michigan influenced these stories? Are there elements of your personal experience that have found their way into particular characters or situations?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I am a Michigander through and through. I survived the Michigander versus Michiganian culture wars, and Michigander came out on top. I'm very much a Michigander. One of the funny things, the friends, I haven't lived in Michigan in over 10 years, like I said, but all my friends and all my colleagues and my coworkers and my fellow writers, whenever they've gotten to know me, when folks ask about where I write from, I always point, and they've kind of started mimicking it, and that's always funny. It's clearly who I am. The thumb uh, is also I for as much as I am a Michigander, I am a thumb buddy. I love that area, and it is very much this space. I did read a piece that starts in Saginaw. I spent a lot of my time in Saginaw. Go Cards! I am a SVSU grad, but I think that the thumb and its isolation geographically and kind of socially is just vastly interesting. I have lots of stories that were in this book that didn't make it in this book, or other stories that I'm working on for other projects. I think it's a really important part of the state, and the state is an important part of the Midwest region, and especially how coastal this country is and how dominant the East and West Coast are in media. I find that the thumb is really what I care about writing.
We can feel that care throughout the stories. I want to say, I think you highlighted so many interesting characters with different backgrounds and perspectives and challenges and triumphs. So I think it feels very authentic, at least as I was reading it.
Thank you.
Um, the collection, it features multiple perspectives on staying versus leaving those small towns. How has your own experience with this decision influenced how you portrayed characters making similar choices?
Yeah, so when I first started writing about the thumb, and I didn't think anybody would want to read it. So I wrote this one story about these Detroit expats who moved out to a town that I randomly picked on a map. It was called Plentywood, Montana, just because I liked the line, "You could spit into Canada. It was so close to the border." And that story never got published anywhere. I wrote it as an undergrad because I was like, nobody wants to read about the thumb. I think I was like 19 or 20 or something like that. And I had moved away from home. I was like, yeah, I'm never going back. And so there was like that typical teenage disdain for your hometown. And then when I moved out of Michigan, it really took off that I did love this place. And maybe because I was really protective, I would get a couple negative remarks in classes and then from writers outside of the area. One of the phrases was dumb redneck stories, and I got protective of it. So my earlier writings when I had first moved out of Michigan were very much blinded by my like defensive love for the space. And I was like, nah, this place, it's a great place to come from and it's a great place to go to, and I'm gonna write about it. And then as the years have moved on, my love for the place has been balanced a little bit more by a respect for the place and the people that are there, but then also like a holding accountable of the people and the place itself. It is not just like anywhere else. I've lived throughout the Midwest, and I've lived in the Pacific Northwest, and now I live in the South. People are imperfect everywhere, and I think it's important to write about the joys and the nice things, but also highlight the issues as well. And
That
that
is, yeah, please.
oh, that just comes out of having moved and left.
I hear you when you talk about, the importance of standing up for where you're from, right? People can have so many notions and stereotypes, that they attribute to, people who people like yourself, people who you care about. And so I think, this work definitely shines as like a piece of almost like advocacy, for the thumb.
Thank you.
Throughout the collection, characters struggle with the idea of home as both comforting and confining. Has writing these stories, has it shaped your own perspective of home? I think you touched on this a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, my parents still live in Tuscola County. They still live on the Cass River, and that is still very much home. I'm a millennial who never thought he would buy a house, and I was lucky enough. My partner Jessica and I did buy a house recently, and we love it. We're working on it. We just painted part of the basement last night, so it's nice, and it is our home together. But my home is like I'm still very much there. I go up to Michigan, up in the thumb, usually every November to go hunting with my dad. And then throughout, I have some tour events in Detroit area in May, and I'll go up to the thumb anyway. Because there's a bar in downtown Caro called the Oasis, and they've got new owners, and I think it's all you can eat wings on Wednesday. I think it is. And I haven't gone there yet. They have a good cheeseburger, and I know that, but I want to eat all their chicken wings, so of course that's just a reason.
Shameless plug to the Oasis
Yeah.
if you find yourself in Caro. um, I guess, we can move on a little bit to some of the meat of the stories as well. Characters, I'm going to pull from the stories. Characters such as Dick Finney and Rid Sr., they represent many different aspects of rural Michigan life. What were the inspiration for these characters, right? Like someone like Rid Sr., he's like a kind of rich landowner in the area. I mean, how did you get this inspiration for this character and telling these, particular types of people's stories?
Yeah, well, I grew up in a working class family. My sister and I are first generation college students. My dad's worked for the automotive industry, and that's we all know the automotive industry since the late 70s and 80s in Michigan. So we grew up not rich landowners. So there was always in a small town, just like I mean, I lived in Chicago for years. You know the rich people. Chicago is big enough that you can live your own life and kind of be invisible and get on with your own P's and Q's. A small town, it's felt a little bit more like we all know that person because we go to school with people who have the same last name, and the school is on the street that has that same last name. And we all know who sold that tract of land to Walmart and who sold that land to the golf course. And that's not to say that if you're rich, you're a bad person at all, or if you're poor, you're a good person. Um, I think that some of my characters, they do make it work. They are economically viable. Tim, in Enough to Lose, the story itself, he ends up having a successful business, and he's a very loving father who just wants to build a car with his daughter. Rid Senior, he's one of those rich folk that do fit the stereotype that they are living their life for themselves, and they have the power to make those around them live their lives for him as well. Um, and we see that across the country. We see those who have make the rules for those who have not, and the McKinnons of the world have have to eat and still play by the rules. So he's established, like Rid Senior. He's a very established character. He's established in the thumb. He's comfortable. Dick Finney's a little different. Dick Finney had an escape. He was going to get out. He had people welcoming him outside, like it was whether it was East Lansing or Chicago. He had a path, an option, and his other option was stay. And he stayed, and it did not he turned into somebody completely different. Whether he's good or bad, because we see him come up in Too Close, Too Loud later. He's older, and he's become Rid Senior-esque without the money. So I'm fascinated by who would I have been had I stayed. I worked at a bank in my hometown for a few years. There's also part of me that if my mom had said, yes, you can play hockey, she said no to that. So who would I be at 36 years old? I would be beer league hockey guy and have probably never read a book or something. So I'm fascinated by like these options and these paths that turn us into who we are.
I think that's a theme that came up quite often across many of these stories, finding out how characters dealt with their choices or lack thereof. And it's so interesting to see over time how that unfolds across generations, in fact. You titled the collection, you mentioned it a moment ago, you titled the collection after a specific story. What about the story Enough to Lose captured the essence of this entire work for you?
The story was the first story I ever wrote. I was mowing lawns of bank repossessions during the housing crisis. So I was up in Caseville. So for those of you who don't know, Caseville is a nice little in the inside of the thumb. It's like a kind of a resort town. They have the cheeseburger and Caseville Jimmy Buffett themed festival every year, but it's a small place, and it has, people's their cottages or their summer houses. And they were all there was just tracks of them abandoned, and I mowed them so they looked lived in. And I would do that from Flint all the way up to Caseville and all the places in between. And I was like, man, what if I ran into the former owner of this place, of this double wide in Clio? What if I had run into this person and I would be mowing and I would think about this story. And I, of course, I never ran into anybody. And that's the joy of fiction. And I wrote the line that has the phrase enough to lose in it. And when I title stories and I have students come in, they're like, what should the title of this be? I said, find your favorite line and pull from that. So that's what I did to make the story enough to lose. And I didn't know what the title of the book was going to be. And I didn't even think it was going to be a book. I just turned it into a manuscript, and my friend Lauren, she said, "It's enough to lose." That's the title of the book, and it was just so perfect, and she was so confident with it. It's like, yeah, that's right, because the theme is like, some of these people they make a go, they make their life work. But I grew up working class, and I mean, I know it's kind of a cliche now, and we say it and we see it in online comments all the time, but most of us are closer to impoverished than a billionaire. Like it's just the fact of our lives. Uh, 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 Delaney, she's got enough. She's a business owner. She owns property, and she is an act of terrorism away from becoming an opioid addict, from losing her business. And that was no choice of herself. That was an act from somebody else. No spoilers. I won't give away any spoilers. But and that's kind of my area of expertise is working class studies, and Enough to Lose is kind of a thesis of mine. It's we are so close to, I mean, I don't want to sound like a downer, but most of us are close to losing.
Yeah, that precarity, it definitely shines through in a lot of those stories. And even how Delaney herself kind of, she's a person who is really hardworking. She sees herself as not so different than the people she lives around. But the way she is seen in the community, she's a person who has enough. And maybe she kind of has different values and beliefs about the world. And she finds herself on the outs with her neighbors who she admires and wants to be close with. Um, your stories, you mentioned a moment ago the Great Recession. And so I think this is like a great time to kind of pivot. Your stories span from the mid 1980s through about 2019, so pretty recent day. And you're documenting like economic and social changes in Michigan's some region. You're talking about the Great Flood of 1986 as well as the Great Recession. And so for folks who are tuning in who may not be familiar with the Great Flood of 1986, this disaster, could you talk more about it?
Yeah, I think I might have show and tell. One sec. It might be here. I didn't think I was going to be asked about this. Oh no, oh yeah, no, it's here. I wrote that story. So it's this first story. It's called The Mirror. And I can retire now because somebody gave me this. This is the Tuscola County Advertiser from September 17th, 1986. Oh, and it
Wow.
smells. So that's downtown Vassar. And that's the town just south, just downriver from Caro on the Cass River. And uh here's another one. I think this is the Bay City Times. No, this is the Detroit Free Press. The Great Flood of 86. And yeah, on the back too. It's an entire farmland. It's a barn, and that's not grass. That's all river water. So my parents moved up from the Allen Park area, and that was their first big test, was the flood of 86. And my mom was pregnant with my sister, and I did not exist. I think I was just an idea my dad had, and my mom. So they turned out just fine. My sister is living her best life, with her partner as well. My thoughts were though, they made it work. they made it work. The house is still there. They still can't get affordable flood insurance because the flooding FEMA designated the flood zone about 10 yards outside of their house, so they still don't have affordable flood insurance. Um, but my thought was, folks lost more than my parents did. And I think that, as a writer, a way to honor them is to be a witness to that. And I played that a little bit with Jackie and her husband Chubbs, and the it just kind of sets the tone for a lot of these pieces that there is loss, there is enough to lose, but we can take from that loss and create something. So Jackie ends up staying in the thumb for decades. And we don't see her until much later in the book in the 2000s. And we realize that she lived a happy life and that she gave birth to somebody who also was so adamant on making her life work in this area. And for a long time she does. So I think that the Great Flood of 86 is just, it's really important. I do write a lot about, it's not in the book itself. I write a lot about the 1871 and 1881 Great Fires that were a result of poor lumbering choices. Um, and it's just another natural disaster. So that's why I wrote about that.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. The Mirror was such a powerful story to begin with.
That's the
And I
first
think,
time I ever killed a character.
well, it was quite dramatic. You did it like a professional. How did you're showing us these, like archival newspapers, and here at Bridge, Michigan, we are in journalism. This is just making my heart warm to see
Should have
old
brought
print.
it. I should have had it ready to go. I'm sorry I had to step away there.
No, that was great to see that old print. How did you research the specific historical and economic conditions of each time period? Um, and how did these disasters shape your conception of the not quite fictional community and its residents?
Part of it is having lived in the region for so long, and like I said, we have ideas of stories of big cities and living in big cities. Like we know these people, we know the Pritzkers in Illinois and the Lees down here in Tennessee. Like we know those big names. They are kind of mythical creatures, though, because these areas are so big. But in small towns like Caro, like we know these people, we know their stories, we know our people, and we know our stories, and they just kind of one of the things I love about the thumb is that it, the stories don't necessarily change. Like the stories that are told at the corner diner they come in cycles, much like the economy comes and goes in cycles. So those 10 old men that sit at the diner and tell those stories 15 years later, they'll tell that same story and be like, well, this reminds me of so and so. And then they're like, oh, yeah, that was in 2008. And then the other guy's like, no, that was in 1998 or something. It's a cycle. So those stories do stay pretty similar. And we see that in this collection too. I did that on purpose with cell phone towers coming in. And then at the end, wind turbines coming in. It's the same thing. Technology changes and it comes in, and the community has differing opinions about it. But if you strip it all down, there's no difference between a wind turbine and these cell phone towers.
Thank you so much for addressing that. As I was reading, I definitely noticed, as I'm sure many of our readers did, that tension of cell towers coming in and later turbines, and later, it really becomes it comes to a crux,
Yeah.
especially with the wind turbines. Um, these stories, they're so interconnected, and there are the locations themselves are almost like characters. Like Bucky's Bridge is, I mean, it returns as if it's a character. It's living and breathing. Owendale Drop, same thing. And there are so many generations of connected characters like Jamaica and Dick and the McKinnons. I mean, did you initially conceive these as standalone stories, or did you always picture them as an interconnected collection?
I did see them as interconnected, but that was when I was writing different stories that didn't end up in this book, or maybe a couple stories ended up and they changed a lot. And in my mind, and this goes to like a book is not one person's creation. Like there was a team of folks that helped me on every step of the way. Like the acknowledgments page, every one of those names are so absolutely important to the creation of this book. In my mind, the connections were always there. And then my agent and then the editorial team at Wayne State University Press, they were all like, ramp it up a little bit more. Like you have a not an unnamed background character in the run. Who could that be? And I was like, oh, yeah, he's that character from that story. And it really kind of became almost like fan service. I was like, oh yeah, if they read this story first, I'll make this name and I'll make the name clear that when it comes back, yeah, it's that same character. So and if it's like little, because I get such an excitement when I read collections of short stories and I'm like, oh yeah, that was the little girl from the first story and now she's an adult. Oh wow, she did well. That's so cool. I don't need her story. I don't need to see the 30 years in her life. I just need to see that she's here and she's thriving. And so I tried to go for that with my pieces. But then also like the stereotype of a small town is everybody knows everybody, and that's not true at all. Like Caro is 4,000 people, and there's so many people I don't recognize. I think the area around Caro is like 12,000 now. So there's people walking down the street, and I'm like, I don't know that person, but I probably know somebody who knows that person, which is just another degree of me not knowing that person. I can get like half of a story of that person. So that's why there's characters that are in the background of one story that are main characters in another story because they're not the main character of that other person's story, just like our own lives. Yeah, yeah.
Seeing characters, return to the fold was just such a joy. I had to flip back and forth between stories because there were names that I remembered earlier in the collection that appeared much later. And I said, wait, did I hear the name Scott much earlier? And so it was just such a pleasure to kind of find those Easter eggs, so to speak, in the stories.
Yeah.
Um, so in your first story, The Mirror, which you talked about a moment ago, and for our listeners, that's the story that highlights the Great Flood. That first story, The Mirror, it ends with a death, and the stories, the entire collection actually concludes with another death in streaks of white and color. What made you decide to bookend the collection with those particular moments of gravity?
That was a question I had never been asked before. So when you sent that question to me, I was like, "Oh, I need to come up with a smart answer." And I will fail all of you. I don't have a smart answer for that. But one thing folks have said that there's a lot of sadness in this book, and I can see that. I can definitely see that. Especially in some of my answers that I've had today, where it's like, yeah, when we talk about the economy, there's especially from somebody who grew up working class, there's not a lot of happiness when we talk about the economy. Um, so there's that. But when I look at, and maybe I'm too close to it, so I tell folks to look for those really gorgeous moments because I can see them. Like Tim, I mentioned the character Tim. He comes back and he's got such a small role after playing the main character in the title story. But you don't need to know the rest of his life. You know that he's made enough money to buy an old Trans Am and that he has a daughter who's about ready to be driving age. And the two of them are working on it together. And that's it. I mean, it's in a story that has, terrorism and people feeling ostracized in a small town. But there's these other moments that are like, oh wow, yeah, he worked hard and got a few lucky breaks and look at him now. And then there's other ones like it ends with this, the book does end with a death, but that character's life wasn't what wasn't heroic in a sense that she won, but she made so much beauty. And that's kind of what I was going for with that. Um, And then in the beginning, in the mirror, it starts with a death, mostly because the Great Flood didn't result in any deaths in Caro, if I'm remembering correctly, but people lost livelihoods. And in many ways, that is like a death. So I kept that going. But out of that, like, we get to see Jackie create a really gorgeous life, and we get to see neighbors loving their neighbors, even if they're strangers. We get to see teams of people putting themselves at risk while nature's pouring down on them just to help each other out. And I think that that's, yes, we bookend with death, but there's also all these really gorgeous parts around it. I do not have an answer for why I bookended it like that. Um, so I'm sorry.
I think that was a great answer. And the mirror, I think what you touched on a moment ago was such a great story because I'm picturing, the community coming to actually like evacuate and rescue other community members in spite of not getting the proper notification from like in the story, the county hasn't really caught up to what people on the ground are seeing. And so neighbors are coming to the rescue of each other in that story. And although it is tragic, it is also, like you said, very hopeful and beautiful, and it unfolds very beautifully throughout the rest of the story as well. Those
Thank you.
effects that ripple.
Thank you. And it kind of answer your question about research too. And then this also answers how much of am I in these pieces. That based off a true story. My parents were evacuated by strangers that ended up becoming great family friends that are still great family friends. So,
Thank you so much for sharing that.
yeah.
Um, there are several stories that feature characters who profit from other people's misfortune. They're not evil people, they're not bad people. They're people who are caught in the same system. I'm thinking of Tim mowing foreclosed lawns, Delaney reselling estate items. And
Mhm.
there's so much economic precarity as a theme here. I mean, what do you hope that readers are come away with understanding about the financial struggles in like these rural communities?
Um, I I would like folks to read it and see that if they are reading characters who are outside their own lived experience, I would like for them to see that this is a lived experience. It's a work of fiction, but it's rooted in what people are living through during any economic recession, during a depression. I mean, officially speaking, the Great Recession in 2008, 2009 ended in 2014, and it didn't. I would go home still, and it was felt for years after it officially ended. And I was living away from Michigan at the time. That's when I first moved away, and people didn't think about it. People didn't think about how the housing crisis also fed into the continuing decline of the automotive industry, and how that's felt so acutely by Michiganders. They We're coastal. We're a coastal country, and we're called flyover state. We're an ignored space. And I just don't think that's fair. I'm angry about it still. It's almost 20 years ago now, and I'm still mad about it. And I think that to talk about it, to highlight these lives, like, yes, it's fiction, but these are representative of real experiences.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And for our listeners here, we're going to take a couple more of the discussion portion questions that I have planned. And thank you all for dropping your questions in the chat. We will definitely get to those in just a moment. I'm going to ask a couple more questions, though. Um, so the collection, you know, the character Leah in the last story, the blink and it's gone. She creates paintings documenting community changes in this series she creates over time. And I couldn't help but think this parallels your own work as a writer documenting similar changes. Was this an intentional, projection, or did you come up with this just organically?
My sister is a fantastic visual artist, and it's it's anything visual. Like, she's a good sculptor. She had a painting up at the State House for a while. She had a mural in I believe it was Ann Arbor. Like she's just such a great artist. And for the longest time, like I still don't really see myself as an artist. I see myself as a writer. And I kind of it was like an honor to her. Like I loved this idea of this artist who was trying to make a go in the small town. Um, and then I also like I at the time I had a creative writing degree and I thought I was going to be a high school history teacher and then I didn't get my teaching certificate. So I was living in my sister's attic on a twin bed and I didn't know what I was doing with myself. And I was like, what? We think about like the logical ends of all these choices in our lives. I'm like, if I stay here, what's the worst thing that could happen? Uh yeah, I'd probably get bored and drink a lot and try to be like one of those like woodsy artists. And then I think of like Ernest Hemingway, who wrote so much in Michigan as well, and his tragic end. And I owned cats as well, just like he did. And I was like, I don't want that for my life. But what if, so she's kind of a little like a amalgam of myself and my sister. Artist trapped in small town.
I hear that. Thank you again, like for sharing. I think that's like very beautiful to write yourself and your sister's kind of experience so deeply and personally there. Um, in I guess, a fun kind of question as we begin to, transition to the reader questions. I have two more questions left. If you were to add another story to this collection, what perspective or time period might you be interested in exploring or popping in there if you already have another one on ice?
There was one that got removed that so the whole building a book is a community thing and there's insight and whatnot. So my agent was there was a story about inspired by the time where I was selling wood at the end of my parents' driveway. So the emerald ash borer, as we know, decimated Michigan's ash canopy, which was a the ash canopy existed after we decimated the pine canopy in the 1800s, blah, 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 blah. But my dad and my mom are still cut ash wood, and that's been dead for over a decade. So I wrote this story about this guy who my dad would always say, you got to be careful of those widow makers. He called them widow makers, the ones that are still standing because they can fall at any moment. I was like, yeah, what if one fell on me while I was out here by myself? So I wrote that story. It ended up being a ghost story. I published it elsewhere, and he's like literally visited by the ghost of his dad and his wife, and I can't remember somebody else. So he's like I wrote myself into a corner. The character's trapped under a log, and I was like, oh, he can't go anywhere. So what's gonna happen? So my agent was like, you gotta take it out. There's no other ghosts. It kind of doesn't fit. And I was like, okay, I'll do that. Just publish the book, please. So that one took place. That one was 90s, before cell phones were everywhere. And that's one of the things I had to think about. Like, I could pull out my cell phone and call 911 if I got trapped under a tree. And then it would be nice. It would have been nice, and I've never figured out how to write about it. Would be to write about the 1871 or 1881 wildfires during the lumber baron times. I have an essay coming out next year that talks about it, but that's the closest I've gotten to actually publishing about it.
I am looking forward to possibly hearing and seeing that. I will, that is a perfect segue into my last question here, which is, are you currently working on any other stories that you'd like to share with this group or give us a look forward about?
Yeah, so the story that I read from Getting Out, that turned into a novel draft that I'm in a middle draft about. So Cal's the name of that character. He is the protagonist, and Kate is more developed of they don't live in Saginaw anymore. They do live in Caro, and she's doing quite well for herself. He's in his situation, he's formerly incarcerated, and they have a teenage son who is kind of pulled between both of them. So more along the lines of what choices am I going to make as a 16-year-old, and how will that echo? Do I want to be my mom? Do I want to be my dad? So there's that. There's a corrupt police officer who has a nice black market going on between here and Sarnia across the Blue Water Bridge. So there's that's going on too. And then I have another novel that I'm working on, and it takes place deeper in the thumb, a lot of more isolated areas, inspired somewhat by Terry Nichols and Timothy McVeigh. Only if they were very, very Christian and created a successful cult. And the woman in my female protagonist, she is trying to get into the cult so she can get her brother out of the cult. And then the whole reference that I made right there, for those of you who don't know, I'm sure most of us know that Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols built those bombs and practiced in the thumb of Michigan. For those of you who didn't know, surprise.
Surprise. Those sound like fascinating stories that will be coming out soon. For our listeners here, how can they stay abreast of what you're doing?
Yeah, well, I still am on Facebook, so RS Deeren on Facebook. I post mostly about my students and cats. And then I'm also rsdeeren.com, which is a summer project for me to update. But I'm online. It's my name right here in the corner, either on Facebook or any social media. I'm not on Twitter anymore, or just my website. I'm also doing a lot of stuff down here for the students. The students down here are a lot like the students of Saginaw Valley, regional, rural, working class, and they're just gorgeous storytellers in their own right.
Thank you for that so much, RS. I'm going to transition us for these last couple minutes into some of the readers submitted questions. Michael wanted to know over what time frame did you write these stories? And I guess you answered if you had any thought of using them as the basis for a novel. You did just answer that for us.
Yeah. Well, so the first one started. I was working as a line cook at Bennigan's in Saginaw, Michigan, and I got fired, even though I was in the right. And I needed a job, so I got on at this a bank owned these a bank owned these houses, and they leased out these two trailers and F-150s, and I got on a crew, and I was just mowing lawns, and it was like 2011 or 2012. And I was writing those. I graduated college in 2012, I think. Yeah, 2012. So there was that. Uh, then 2012, 13, 14, I was just living in Caro and kind of putzing at some stories. And then throughout 2015, 16, 17, 18, I wrote these stories and I created the book. And then it became a back shelf or a back burner thing. I went in 2017, I started my PhD, and I was not ready for how all-encompassing that was. So I did that for 5 years. And then refocused back on the book.
Thank you so much. We have a question from Deborah. She asked this a little bit earlier. She wanted to ask about one of the words you use, which is often seen as like a pejorative,
Mhm.
the term redneck. It comes up a lot. It comes up across the course of your book. She wanted to know, can you tell us about that phrase in the thumb? How does it fit into your work and identity?
I never heard it when I was in the thumb. I Nobody ever called it to nobody else. I didn't. I mean, there was cliques in high school and whatnot. I heard it a lot after I left. And like the cultural history of that was a term of pride. Like it was workers who were unionizing. Like there's a labor rights history to that word that is so empowering. But like with any word, it can be used as a pejorative. So yeah, I can't remember. You know, my dad says hill jacks, and there's no hills in the thumb of Michigan. But he had the Deeren family come from eastern Ohio in the outskirts of Appalachia. So I think that's where he might have gotten it from. But yeah, redneck itself, for me, I don't use it particularly because I don't want to take the time to be like, well, actually, the history of that is it's an empowering word, so I'll take that as a compliment. It's just easier to use other people are using that phrase, and if they're going to use it as an insult, I we kind of know it as an insult.
I appreciate you sharing that, kind
Yeah.
of dual perspective and history for a word that I think is tossed around quite a bit in the present day.
Yes.
Um, we have a question from Janet. She was curious, for which of your recurring characters do you have the strongest sense of what happened to them between their appearances? As a writer, were there any particular characters?
Well, the easy answer was Tim. He worked as a he did the job I did, and then ended up making his own landscaping company. So we see like goat cars throughout the book or whatever, and then also in my novel too. He exists in my novel as in my first novel as well. He makes a go of it. One of the things that's interesting is Scott Butcher. He's the opposite. He doesn't interact much with Tim, if at all. I don't remember, but Scott makes all the wrong choices, and many of that is because of who he is. He is a closeted gay man boy in the first time we see him, and we really fully realize that when we see what happens to him. So he is incarcerated, but he has a line that he says to Dick. He goes, I get to be who I want to be here. And for us, it's so tragic, but also like the things that he does, should we feel bad for him? But then also, should we feel good for him? Because of his situation and what he has done. So yeah, in the back of my mind, he's living in his perspective the best life he can.
That was a particularly, tragic character, and I appreciate you sharing like these ways of viewing him that are a little more charitable to someone who, ultimately, does something really heinous.
Yeah, yeah.
So I would like to ask just really quickly for our group. I hear people in the chat. I mean, they're making like, they're drawing parallels. Have you heard of this story? This story? Do you have any books or stories that perhaps you read that inspired this collection that you might like to share out with the group?
Yeah, there are so the first thing that really made me feel like I had permission to write about small town Michigan was a collection of short stories that did come out from Wayne State University Press years ago. It's Bonnie Joe Campbell's American Salvage. That it was nominated for a National Book Award, and it I'm just getting chills thinking about it. That collection, and in particular, there's a story in there called Bringing Belle Home, and it takes place in a bar, and it's these two extremely flawed characters. Folks on the outside would say these two are losers and that we shouldn't feel bad for the things that they get into. And for me, those two characters are so absolutely beautiful. They're two of my favorite Michigan characters that I've ever read. So there's that. I do have over here, this didn't inspire me to write, but this is Bear County, Michigan by John Counts that came out this year. And that takes place like up in this area and a little bit up into the UP. Bonnie Joe Campbell writes about the Kalamazoo area, and I'm over here in the Thumb. I mean, also, I was raised on the classic canon. So when I first started reading about poor people, it was through William Faulkner. And I haven't read William Faulkner in over a decade now, but I still do have a love for him. Uh, then there's also, contemporary speaking, the work of Jesmyn Ward. Her work is just the way she writes rural spaces, and she writes from a black perspective. Her rural characters are just so absolutely gorgeous and extremely flawed and tragic. So I'm very in love with the work that she does. So, Salvage the Bones, National Book Award winner. Sing Unburied Sing, another National Book Award winner. And then when I was finally tightening up the page, tightening up the book itself, I might have it. I might have it here. I don't. There's a collection of short stories called From the Hilltop, and it's by the author Tony Jensen. And that some stories take place in Texas, and it's just gorgeous. It's a good collection of short stories.
Well, I am so glad I had a chance to ask you that question. I will gladly follow up and get a list of those recommendations for when I send out my post-event email. I would love to be able to share out additional recommendations to our listeners here who are interested in learning more about the kind of stories that inspired this collection. So I'm going to begin wrapping us up. I want to say, first of all, thank you. I have a tremendous amount of appreciation for RS Deeren here today, as well as, my bridge team who tuned in and helped out, as well as all of our viewers today. I would like to remind you all that we will be posting a recording in Bridge Michigan website, app, and social media this week. The recording will show up on our events page, and so you all will receive that link in a follow-up email. Culture Club events are held every other month, and we will have our next one in June 2025. Keep your eye on your inbox for a post-event survey, where I'll ask for your suggestions of books, films, and podcasts for us to consider for the rest of the Culture Club events this year. I have a reminder here that if you'd like to be eligible to receive our next Culture Club selection, consider becoming a Bridge Club member today. You can join for as little as $1. Uh, thank you all so much. Have a wonderful day. And thank you, RS.
Thanks, everyone. This was such a joy.
Have a great one all.